Services Marketing, Part 2. Part 2 of Services Marketing focuses specifically on the characteristics of services. These were introduced in Part 1, and now we're going to look at them in more detail. Before we move on to today's topic, let's recap on what we looked at in Part 1. So we looked at the core definition of services marketing, and we looked at how one of the core elements of services is that there's a lack of ownership when you consume a service. We established that services differ from goods along various dimensions. We talked about how a service is an act or a performance, and that act or performance is done by both the service provider and the consumer of a service. A service elicits some form of change within the customer, whether that's a change in the nature of the possessions they have, or a more intangible change to their sense of well-being or enjoyment. And we also saw that services form the basis of any modern economy. So in talking about services, we're talking about something fundamental to the whole scope of business. Here is a reintroduction to the 4 core characteristics of services. In Part 1, we talked about how the underpinning characteristic is lack of ownership. And then on top of lack of ownership, we build these 4 characteristics: intangibility, inseparability, perishability, and variability. Let's focus on the first characteristic, intangibility, which means unable to be touched. And that is literally what it means. It comes from the Latin tangere, which means to touch. So something that's intangible just simply cannot be touched. It means it's beyond our grasp. We can't sense it in a normal way. And this can be a problem for us as customers because we can't use the senses in the same way as we do when we're trying to purchase, for example, a physical product. So if you were to go and buy a new bag for uni, you can visit a shop, you can pick it up, feel the material, see the quality of the workmanship, you can try it on, you can then go away and think about it and perhaps look at a range of different bags. Then you can buy it if you like it, and then if you find a better one, you could even return it and get a refund. All of these things are basically impossible with a service. You can't pick it up, try it on, buy it, and then return it if you decide that you don't like it at a later date. For example, you can't order a meal, eat it, and then decide you didn't enjoy it and return it. The experience is over. So this creates a number of difficulties for us as marketers. To help customers in decision making with buying a service, marketers provide tangible cues to help the customer make the right decision before purchasing. Think about how you might use tangible cues in your decision making process in a service situation we all find ourselves in sometime, like a restaurant, for example. Going to a restaurant for lunch, what tangible cues might you use, and which senses would you use in each case to make those decisions? You might use sight, for example, to read the menu, look at the prices, consider the decor of the restaurant. You might want to see if the restaurant is busy. You may also use smell. Does it smell nice, appetizing, or is there a smell of burning, for example, which is something you don't want coming from the kitchen of a restaurant? When you're inside, you may see if the staff greet you and show you to a table with courtesy and sincerity, or perhaps they ignore you. How does this make you feel? You may go in and hear that they are playing really bad music on the speaker system, and it's not to your taste. Perhaps it's too loud, or just a genre of music you're not into. You might want to choose somewhere quieter. So the intangibility of services makes them a risky purchase for us as consumers. So the more tangible marketers can make the service product, the more we feel we are reducing the risk we're taking on as a customer. And one of the things that's very important to tangibilizing services is the branding. And I'm sure you have experience of seeing branded restaurants that are commonplace on the high street, or if you go to an airport, for example, most of the restaurants you see usually belong to a branded chain. And that is marketing in action, trying to tangibilize and use tangible cues to communicate quality and reliability and lack of risk to us as customers. So there are some characteristics that we can associate with intangibility. It reminds us that services are a performance or a form of human effort in their production and consumption. It tells us that there is a higher level of difficulty in evaluating a service because of its intangibility. What variables are you using in order to establish whether something was of quality when you can't pick it up and touch it, smell it, feel it? It reminds us of the non-ownership element of services, because if it's intangible, it inherently cannot be owned and taken away. And we remind ourselves of the importance of using tangible cues in order to communicate quality and low risk to the customer. And that is something that we'll go on to look at in part 3 as well. The next characteristic is inseparability, meaning the service cannot be separated from the customer. In just about all service encounters or service experiences, the customer has to be present while the service is being produced for them. So if you think of getting a haircut, you definitely have to be there in order to get your service experience, because you have to have your hair physically cut. You can't order a haircut to take away. You need to sit in and have it done. If you think of even using a financial service like visiting your bank, you have to be there and play a role in that co-created consumption and production experience of the service. So inseparability means that service delivery requires both the service provider and the service customer to be in contact in order for the service to take place. That's different from manufacturing, where we have a production line and the good can be made in a production line, perhaps even in a different country, stored, shipped, and then delivered to the customer once they buy it. The inseparability of a service requires customer presence. It requires service provider contact, that co-created interaction, and that returns us to the Vargo and Lush research in service dominant logic, looking at how the beneficiary is actually a creator of some of the value that they consume. And that reminds us of the fact that service is a performance, and the performance is going on both sides of the service encounter, both from the producer and the consumer. And if we take the two characteristics we've discussed so far, intangibility and inseparability, they tend to be the principal pillars of the service experience, something that we are consuming when we are buying a service. Intangibility and inseparability create the service experience which, if it's managed well, adds value to the overall service encounter and enables businesses to charge more because the intangible quality of that encounter increases the value. Creating that positive service experience allows differentiation from competitors, and that has shifted us into the contemporary experience economy. But the interesting thing is that at their core, services are often homogeneous, even though we're going to come on and talk about how they can vary. Actually, what you're buying at the very core is often the same, and the service experience differentiates into being something that you associate with a particular brand. If you take some simple everyday encounters that we all have, for example, most of us will fly on a plane certainly once a year. If you're a student studying overseas, it's very likely you're required to travel on airplanes more often. But at its core, air travel is delivering you from A to B. And whether you're on a Ryanair flight or a Virgin Atlantic flight, you're going to be getting the same underpinning service. You're going to start in one location and end in another, but the service experience that is created differentiates, so the experience you would have on board a Ryanair flight is naturally going to be different from the one you'd have on a Virgin Atlantic flight. Getting your hair cut, you expect to walk out with shorter hair perhaps, and maybe different colour hair, but if you go to a local barber's and pay €7 compared to going to a more luxurious established hairstyling chain like, say, Tony and Guy, the service experience you're going to have is going to be different in each place. And perhaps even things like your gym membership, the style of gym that you're a member of, ultimately that's an example where you are responsible for the product, because the idea is that you become fitter or stronger as a result of going there. But the environment and the service experience you have in, say, the university gym compared to a more high-end gym chain like Virgin Active are going to be very different. Let's look at our next characteristic, variability, meaning services are heterogeneous in that they are changeable. Every time you encounter a service, it's likely to be different. So services, therefore, are difficult to standardize. What exactly is it that makes it so variable and challenging to standardize for service marketers? Well, as we've just discussed, inseparability means that customers and service providers have to interact with each other. The nature of that free-flowing interaction means that there are a lot of factors which are outside the control of the service provider. Say, for example, your normally cheerful hairdresser is in a bad mood. How might this affect your service experience? What if, to get over a bad mood, you're looking to have a complete image makeover? So the stakes are set higher for your haircut, and if your hairdresser is in a bad mood, that might have a doubly negative impact if the result isn't what you hoped for. So how might this affect your overall service experience? And that's certainly likely to be different to the next time you go for a haircut. Other customers can also affect our service experience. You see on the slide an airport, a busy airport departure lounge. Here the presence of other customer groups could negatively impact on the quality of our service experience. However, completely contrary to that, in other situations, you might actually want other customers to be there. Imagine going to a nightclub. We've all been there when you turn up at a nightclub and there's only about 5 other people there. That's going to negatively impact your service experience, and it's something that is directly in that moment out with the control of the business. The important point to make is that heterogeneity of services make them very difficult to manage. In many cases, this changeability and variability is difficult to predict and plan for, and can have significant impacts on the success and the sustainability of a business. In many cases, organizations focus on operating systems and standard procedures, and in particular they focus on staff training to try to ensure some level of consistency in service delivery. If you've got a job, you may have had training in service procedures. In addition, many companies count on problems happening, but make sure that they can put the matter right quickly. Therefore, they offer very good customer service and complaints procedures. For instance, in restaurants, this might mean that if a customer complains about a meal, then waiting staff know that they have the ability to automatically offer a refund. And we'll come on to talk about this later in the service recovery section in part 4. So let's look at those characteristics of that main characteristic of variability. It reminds us that standardization is difficult within services. It puts a focus on getting right the process of selection, training, and rewarding staff as they deliver their duties. Often, evaluation systems are helpful, both in evaluating staff performance and service experience by customers. It also requires the use of reliable equipment. Ensuring that you've got the infrastructure of systems and hardware in your service design allows you to mitigate for the variability that is inevitable within service delivery. Finally, we look at perishability, having a brief life. In the picture you see empty seats. You cannot store the space in a concert hall on one day when it is empty and then use it on another day when there is a sellout concert to make more money. You have to sell the seats on the day that you're running the show, and if you don't sell them, they go, they perish. Unlike a shop, it can store its unsold Christmas stock in January in a January sale, for example, which is something we're all familiar with. So the issue of supply and demand is very important for service managers. In the short term, we can try to meet excess demand by, say, putting on an extra concert when the demand is high. We'll all be familiar with that. Your favourite artist coming to town and so many people are trying to buy tickets that they decide to put on an extra date. But that is difficult to manage in the long term. And that example is something that's difficult for touring artists to do, for example, because the economics of managing a music tour are so complex that adding an extra day to that is actually very difficult. But one of the key techniques to manage supply and demand is using price. So for example, high demand services or peak times will cost more than other times, and they may even offer discounts to tempt customers to purchase services at off-peak times. If you travel on the train between Edinburgh and Glasgow between 4 p.m. and 6 p.m, it costs considerably more because that's peak demand time. Many gyms will offer off-peak memberships, giving people a discounted membership price but limiting them to use the club when other customers aren't using the club so frequently. That tempts people who have different timetables to use the facilities and ups the revenue for the business according to different types of service demand. So perishability reminds us that consumption cannot be stored with services. Once the plane's taken off, you can't sell the seats on the plane. You can't sell last night's hotel beds. That encourages marketers to try and stimulate off-peak demand, to try and manage the spread of revenue that they get across the different times of activities that they have on offer. It also encourages marketers to try and establish secondary spend. Secondary spend is, once you've got customers through the door, trying to maximize the amount of money they spend because they're the customers you have. And if you've ever been on a budget airline flight, for example Ryanair, that's an excellent example of marketing in action trying to get you to secondary spend at every opportunity. Trying to get you to secondary spend on taking extra luggage on board, for joining a speedy queue, for buying food and drink, for buying duty free, for buying scratch cards, for booking rental cars, to the extent that actually Ryanair makes more profit off its secondary spend on board than it does through selling plane tickets. Let's summarize the characteristics of services marketing. Intangibility, unable to be touched. Inseparability, simultaneous production and consumption. Variability, difficult to standardize, and constant dynamic interactions between service providers and service consumers. Perishability, unable to be stored, has a short shelf life. You can't sell yesterday's seats on tomorrow's aircraft. And that gives us a nice little acronym to remember, IVIP. Inseparability, variability, intangibility, and perishability, if you like. But something to use as a reminder for exam revision. That concludes part 2. Up next, we'll be looking at the extended marketing mix in part 3.